Um, Welcome all. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Welcome to the virtual reading group. We are in the midst of reading Hannah Arendt's, or actually finishing Hannah Arendt's collection, Essays and Understanding, edited by the wonderful Jerome Cohn. It's been an exciting book to read, and I want to thank you all for sticking through it. A number of the essays in it are essays I've spent a lot of time with and written a lot about, but many of them, I would say at least half of them, if not more, I had never read before, including the one we're going to read today. And it's been an exciting opportunity for me to read some new Arendt essays and read them with you and share them. I want to just take a minute at the beginning, a few minutes at the beginning of our discussion today to talk a little bit about the group. And for those of you here last week, there was a little bit of a discussion around what the group is about and how we talk about text versus particular problems in the world. I should acknowledge that in the United States, we are about to finish an election that was incredibly contentious and thankfully is going to end with someone who certainly has not dignified the idea of the presidency being either voluntarily or involuntarily removed from the White House fairly soon. And that's something that we should all have in our heads. Hannah Arendt writes about the world. In fact, this essay is about how one writes about the world. And so we can't read Hannah Arendt and not talk about the world we're in. At the same point, and on another way, in this reading group, what we are trying to do is read Hannah Arendt and think through her about the world. One of a metaphor that Hannah Arendt uses that has always been one of my touchstones for her work is this idea that if a group of people are sitting around a table, we are connected by the table, and thus the conversation happens, and we share a world, and the table, the things of the world, unite us and hold us together. You take away the table, and you just have people sitting there, and they are not connected in a meaningful way. What holds us as a reading group together, and this reading group's been going on 6.5 years now, for some of us new, and we always love new people, and we love old people coming back, not old people, experienced people. What holds us together as a reading group is the texts and the power and the thought of Hannah Arendt. She's not a god. She didn't have any divine revelation. She's not always right. But she's a thoughtful, deeply thoughtful, and original thinker who looks at the world around her and tries to think it through with an incredible erudition and with a huge amount of context of both philosophical, literary, poetic history and thought that is at her disposal. And that's what we do. So there was a discussion / argument last week about to what extent we focus on the texts of Hannah Arendt and to what extent we focus on the world, a world in which things like authoritarianism and racism and all sorts of other problems emerge and exist. And one of the reasons I think we had an argument about it is because it's not an easy question. You can't read Hannah Arendt and not think about the world. And yet, at some point, if we're going to read Hannah Arendt, we have to commit ourselves to trying to read her and not um, interrogate her for things that she did or didn't do all the time. And so it's a fine line. And the fact that over the 6 years or plus that we've been doing this group, there have been a few times when that line has burst out into the open. And this was not the first time. And I don't hold that as a problem. I think that's because we're trying to walk a tightrope across what I take to be a very difficult and yet important precipice that we're on. And so as we walk that tightrope, we have to balance the different, the two sides. On the one hand, we are a group around a table held together by a thinker and a text, and we're trying to read that text and think with that thinker. And yet that thinker and those texts are about the world, and we can't keep that world out, and we have to address it. And so all I'm asking for all of us is, as we move forward into our 7th year of this group, that we work to do both. We work to focus on the text, that we are a group committed to reading this particular thinker, not a God, but one that many of us, most of us, I assume the reason we're here, believe has insights and power of thought worth hearing. And yet one of the reasons we are gathered around this thinker and this table is because she thinks about the world, and we can't keep that world out. So that's what I wanted to say about how I see this group walking this line between a textual engagement with a thinker and her texts, and the need to think with her and at times against her around the world that she's writing about. There have been a lot of people who've written me this week about suggestions for how we could do this. I'm going to continue to try and incorporate them. I am working to create a reading group that will be in parallel to this, starting in January, that will deal with some of Hannah Arendt's specific texts on race and read with her Baldwin and Fanon. I'm excited to do that. I think it will add another dimension to what we're doing, but it will exist in not this group will continue, and those who want to participate in that group as well can, and I'm excited to do that. So I just wanted to say we are working to try and raise these questions and expand our ability to think with Hannah Arendt about the world we're in. That said, I want to thank you all for being here and welcome you back into the virtual reading group. The essay we're reading today is concerned with politics in recent European thought. It's a lecture that Hannah Arendt gave at an academic conference. This is one of her more academic, non-popular pieces. That said, the theme of it is exactly what we were just talking about, what I was just talking about the question of the boundary between thinking and the world, thinking and politics. The question she's asking, which by the way is the question that I asked in the first conference that we ever had on Hannah Arendt at the Hannah Arendt Center, which is, does thinking belong in politics? Is it important in politics to think? So much of politics today and is about strategy and power. But what is the place of thinking? And this essay is a defense of political thinking, and thus the importance of thinking in politics. It begins, it's written in 1954. And by the way, it's very much of a companion piece for those who are interested to an essay that Arendt published in the 1950s called The Concept of History in the book Between Past and Future. I don't know. I honestly haven't done the archival research to know exactly, if this is a draft or related to a draft, or she was working on that draft at the time. I don't know that. But the topic is the same. And the overarching topic is the relation between philosophy, thinking, and politics. For Hannah Arendt, most of the history of metaphysics, starting with Plato, exhibits a contempt for politics and a contempt for the realm of human affairs. The trial of Socrates is the event at which philosophers get worried that they will be killed by politicians, by the polis. And what they do is they seek to protect philosophers from the polis. And they do this by creating political philosophy, which is really not political and is more an attempt to justify peace and order. And as we all know, Plato imagines that there should be a philosopher king who would come and use myths and other ways to rule and control the populace. And the goal was to preserve a space for philosophy, not as a political act, but as something outside of politics. The Pascal, writing in much later, basically argues that for Plato and Aristotle, they are academics, that their whole goal, they wear academic robes. Their whole goal is to limit politics and protect philosophy. And this is, from Arendt's point of view, the basic stance of philosophy towards politics from Plato until Hegel. And everything changes with Hegel, because around the time of Hegel, and by the way, also Kant, who only comes in at the end, but around the time of Hegel, philosophy loses this confidence that truth can be had by a philosopher king, by a wise man. And for Hegel, truth is not something to be found up in a world of concepts, but is the unfolding of history. And as a contemporary of Hegel's, Herder, wrote, history is the book of the human soul told in times and nations. And so what happens is, whereas truth used to be a conceptual thing that philosophers, would sit in their rooms or climb a mountain and go and find the truth up there, with Hegel, we start to look for the truth not in the concepts up there, but as an unfolding of historical time and process. And insofar as history is a man-made process, it becomes a human fabrication. And so for Hegel, history is this the truth is brought from the realm of ideas to what he calls the reconciliation of thought and the world. And this is the great Hegelian project, to reconcile thought and action, to reconcile concepts and existence, and to argue thus that all existence is rational. If you're a conservative Hegelian, this is the justification of existence through philosophy. And Arendt sees Hegel and all the Hegelians who come after him, above all Marx, as bringing the philosophical gaze away from the concepts down into the world. The problem is that for most of these Hegelian philosophers, when they bring philosophy down from the concepts into the world, they turn away from the world, because the whole premise is to justify the world for Hegel, or for Marx to improve the world. And so neither in the effort to justify the world for Hegel or to improve the world for Marx do we actually care so much about the world. We care about our theory of the world, the rationality of the world. And so we look beyond the world itself, and we seek to justify the world through scientific theories. And this is why Arendt thinks that most Hegelian and Marxist political philosophy actually is still not political because it doesn't engage with the world. It engages with theories. And it follows these impulse of turning history into a science or politics into a science, the dialectics of Hegel or the materialist dialectics of Marx. Um, and and by the way, she has a line in one of her other books, which I think is just really important. So I'm just going to add it in here. It's not in this text. She says the decline of the interest in the humanities, and especially history, is inevitable in all modern countries. And this is simply a fact. If you look around colleges around the country, there is no program under more pressure with fewer enrollments than history. History is the dying program at colleges. And Arendt thinks that the reason for this is, and the reason for the loss of the humanities, which is also, as you all know, quote unquote, dying, is that we turn history and the humanities into sciences. And then people would rather study political science or sociology than history because they want to govern and control the historical process, not simply understand it, to go back to the essay, Politics and Understanding, which we read a few weeks ago. In any case, Arendt says this is the danger of Hegelian and Marxist approaches to history and to politics, that they actually they take thinking out of politics and replace thinking with science, right? That's the argument. And she says, yet, nevertheless, today we have to take politics seriously, not simply in the Hegelian and Marxist sense, but because of two disturbing experiences, totalitarianism and atomic war. And even though Hegel and Marx turn away from the world towards theory, she says philosophy is prepared to turn to the world through Hegel. And the two schools that she then talks about that turn to the world and try to think it as thinkers, not as scientists, are the French existentialists, and then the German thinkers, Jaspers and Heidegger. She doesn't give them a name. We could call them the German existentialists if you want, or the German phenomenologists. In any case, what she says is that the French existentialists take politics seriously, and they take politics seriously for a couple reasons. One is they largely exist outside of the universities, right? They are not caught up in this sort of university world where they are, driven away from the world into this world of ideas or theories or science. And they put politics at the center. Thus, politics, she says, becomes the solution to what they understand as philosophical perplexities. The fundamental perplexity of Sartre and Malraux and Camus is the meaninglessness of the world, the nausea that one feels at the way the world is absurd, that it has no sense. And the only way to save ourselves for the French existentialists in such an absurd world is revolution. So for those of you who know Arendt's work, I mean, this essay is written 18 years before the book On Revolution is published. And yet you can see here already in 1954, 18 years before or 19 years before On Revolution is published, with her engagement with the French existentialists, an understanding that of what she will later say, which is that that all politics in the modern world has to be revolutionary, insofar as that it's an attempt to save us from the absurdity of life. Well, she won't say that. That's the existentialist. Man must choose freedom and action, not for some end, not because we're Marxists and we want to bring about, a communist utopia, or not because we're liberals and want to bring out a liberal society. We act not for any particular end because there's no good end. We act because that's how we assert our humanity, to act, to be free. And she says, this is a line that she has on page 440, which I just think is an extraordinary page of writing and line. And she says, the utopian elements in this approach to politics, or rather this attempt to save one's soul through political action, right? This is what the existentialists do. We act to save our soul from the absurdity, from just suffering under the nausea of the meaninglessness of life. And so we act. It doesn't really matter where we go, but we act and do something. So the utopian elements are too obvious to be pointed out. It is interesting that the attempt to save human nature at the expense of the human condition comes at a time when we are all too familiar in totalitarian regimes, and unfortunately not only there, with attempts to change human nature by radically changing traditional conditions. So what does that mean? That there's an attempt to save human nature at the expense of the human condition. It means that human nature, to be a rational animal, to be able to be free, to make, to act, to fabricate. We can save human nature by building a new world, by creating things, by creating a politics, by having a revolution, and thus, against the meaninglessness of the world, reassert our humanity, our ability to act, our nature. But we do so, she says, at the expense of the human condition of our meaninglessness, of that we are thrown into a world that we don't control, the fatedness of the world, of the fact that we are mortal and will die and can't control the world. And so the existentialists sort of, she says, diagnose the human condition of one as meaninglessness and ennui and nausea, but then propose a utopian solution to act and revolutionize and make humanity that threatens to undo the human condition. And they do so, she says, at the precise moment at which totalitarianism and other regimes have entered the world, in which the effort to act according to human nature and make the world anew has the potential to do incredible evil and harm. And so it may be that the existentialist, the acting for acting's sake, ends not so important, could be a kind of nihilist action just to do something and break things apart and build and make a new world in a completely amoral and potentially totalitarian or authoritarian sense. And I think that there's no doubt that's what's going on, at least in the United States, for the last 4 years in our politics, and certainly more than 4 years, is a kind of existentialist rage at the meaninglessness and loneliness and purposelessness of a world, and a desire to simply act and do something. And that is, to some degree, how Arendt reads this attempt to make political action by the French existentialists. The other group she then talks about are her two teachers, Jaspers and Heidegger, the German philosophers that she's going to talk about. Many of the French existentialists think of themselves as Heideggerians. Arendt doesn't think that's correct, and she's right about that. But so sometimes they're called the German existentialists. But the basic point here is that for Jaspers, we have an urgent political reality, and yet, like all of these thinkers, there's no truth, there's no wise man who's going to come down and save us. And so what Jaspers does is turns to this thinking of communication, that truth is not some thing out there. Truth is communication. Truth is existing together in between, in a plurality with others. It's a communicative act, truth, a communication with living people and dead people. And it's this communication of truth is what holds us together. And thus, for Arendt, Jasper's, one of his key insights is that he's one of the only philosophers who thinks against solitude, who thinks, who seduces us away from the philosophic attitude of thinking by oneself into communication and plurality. And thus philosophy loses its arrogance toward the common life of men. We've talked in other essays more about Jaspers, but this is the basics of Arendt's interest in Jaspers as a political thinker. The other is Heidegger, who she finds, because of his idea of the world, die Welt, and that man is being in the world, and as a being in the world is being together. She thinks that one can find in Heidegger the foundation also for this kind of a plurality. But she says that's not how Heidegger really interpreted it. He never went there, so we're going to leave that aside. The basic argument she wants to make in the last few pages here is that the impulse of most philosophers is towards solitude or towards science, towards mastery, and that what the existentialists and what Jaspers especially hold are what makes them important is that they are thinkers of the political world who resist the impulse of truth, who resist the impulse of turning towards theory, dialectics, or truth or wisdom, and are simply attempts to think the world. And thus she can end on page 445, where she writes about 2/3 of the way down the page, right after footnote 26. Crucial for a new political philosophy will be an inquiry into the political significance of thought, right? That is, into the meaningfulness and the conditions of thinking for a being that never exists in the singular and whose essential plurality is far from explored when an I-thou relationship is added to the traditional understanding of human nature. It is this attempt to think outside of science, outside of truth, in the plurality of politics, that Arendt is here pointing to. And this is an academic paper and saying, guys, if you're interested in this kind of thinking, look to the existentialists and look to Jaspers and maybe even a little bit to Heidegger. She writes this in 1954. 4 years later, she's going to publish her own effort to, as she calls it, think what we are doing, called The Human Condition, right? And so in many ways, you see the Ursprung, the origin of the human condition here in this essay. And just to remind us, we're going to be reading The Promise of Politics for a little bit first, and then we're going to turn to the human condition in the reading group. So today's discussion in some ways is a jumping off point for both those books, because we're talking about the turn to politics and The Promise of Politics. This book that we're going to start turning to are essays that she now writes in the 1950s, right after this essay, as she's trying to think through what does it mean to think about politics. She ends up not publishing that book that she was working on in that period. And so we have these essays that she never published as a book, and instead she writes The Human Condition. So in a way, the next two books we're reading are books that take this essay and the attempt to think the political and think them through over the next 5 years of her writing life. So anyway, I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation. Just a reminder, there's two different ways you can speak. You can raise your hand, or you can also try and use the chat function, which I have to figure out how to see now. Okay. James Kiberd, start with you. You got to unmute yourself and speak.
Am I there?
Yeah, there you are.
Okay, so last week I raised my hand early in the discussion and then I dropped it. I found that Bill took off where I wanted to take off. The week before, Fran had talked about the challenge of the communists indulging in good deeds for their bad cause. I thought that was fascinating. And then I go back to someone that I've been reading lately, Roger Berkowitz, in Thinking in Dark Times, talking about the importance. You assailed the Assault on Reason by Al Gore, and took me to reasoning is just reasoning, and what we're trying to do here is thinking. And going back to the table analogy that you brought us to this morning, I looked at the baseball on your desk, which is sitting there next to a bottle, and I said, where was Hannah? I mean, I started ranting at the last essays that we read. What about this? What about 1619? What about income inequality? And we got launched. 1954 is when this essay was written. The dancers of the age were Martha Graham, Alvin Ailey, Jose Limon. Merce Cunningham had just started his company. Paul Taylor had just started his company. Willie Mays was about to make the greatest catch in history in the World Series against the Cleveland Indians in the Polo Grounds, which he swept. Bill T. Jones was 2 years old. Obama's parents had never even thought of each other and never met each other, and John Lewis was 14 years old. What you brought to me, Roger, in terms of what our group together, and Hannah Arendt keeps bringing me to the power of thinking, of the power of thought opposing thoughtlessness. And there's no way Hannah Arendt in 1954 was thinking about any of the dancers I was thinking about, or any of the politicians that came out of that age, but she was thinking, and she was giving me places to plant my foot, to launch myself into moving past reason, moving past rationality into an area that I am loving exploring. I would love you to throw my brain against the rock and give me a little scramble.
Well, I appreciate that. James, can you mute yourself again? Just
Yes.
So don't
Yes,
get
absolutely.
feedback. I appreciate that, and I'm sorry you've been reading that guy. You know, I really take to heart what you're saying about the power of thinking. You know, for those of you who've been around the Arendt Center for the now 14 years that we've been going, you know, the center started with a conference called Hannah Arendt on Ethical and Political Thinking, and it was an attempt to ask what is the importance of thinking for politics. For those of you who really remember, when we started the Hannah Arendt Center, it was not the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities. It was the Hannah Arendt Center for Political and Ethical Thinking. And we did so because, like you said, James, to me, the power of Hannah Arendt is this incredibly, almost talismanic determination to think what we are doing, as she puts it, over and over again. And that means to avoid cliches, but also to avoid theories or science, to avoid anything that takes us away from the world of what she calls reality. And the seductions away from reality are numerous, because reality is messy. Reality is often painful. Reality doesn't satisfy what we want. And so, in the origins of totalitarianism, Arendt realizes that reality is something that humans don't like, which is why it's not that hard to seduce them away from it with simple theories and simple ideas and ideologies. Um, and so then she says, well, what does it mean to think who we are, to think what we're doing, to think the world as it is, to say what is, as another one of her famous sayings or favorite sayings from Herodotus. And that's, to me, uh, the ambition of her work. But as a reader and teacher of Hannah Arendt, that's my ambition, right? To say what is, to try and fail, I'm sure, most of the time, to avoid the pitfalls of theory, cliche, uh, simplifications, ideologies, and look at the world as it is. And that's what we try and do. And so I'm hoping that as we go forward in this group, that is our collective ambition.
Excuse me, Roger, because I have to get back to my rehearsal and I precipitated last week's rupture. I'm going to just jump ahead of the line here because I have to leave. And let me say a couple of things. First of all, I think we should never in this era use we as you're using it so casually. Who are we on this call? That is from the point of view of a privileged class that for the last 500, 600 years, some people say 1,000, everything has been generated by you, for that class. So last week, when I took issue with the fact that she did not see America as the way I saw America, it was a very important moment for this talk, because who has the authority right now to say we? That's what we're fighting for, to even be able to say that. Many of us really hate each other's guts now. So when we are on a call like this and we can speak in magisterial we are not thinking. And then one last anecdote is when I came into the art world was seeing itself as, even though particularly my modern dance had started in a socialist context, but the art world was divided between those who were Apollonian and those who were Dionysian. The Apollonian, I would assume, would be the classicist, quote, the thinkers, the thinking form, and the expressionists would be the crazy people who are coming from this place of Jungian, Freudian feeling. So it was considered, there was a moment when there were some people in the vanguard, or I'm saying gatekeepers, who were saying we should not let people put politics on stage. Could you believe there was a time when people actually said that? Yeah. Politics do not belong on stage. And here we have Hannah Arendt at the same time in the 50s, actually mentioning Jaspers and all, who are saying politics is the meaning of philosophy. So I have nothing more than to say that I apologize. And here it is, I'm doing this this rescuing thing that Black people do sometimes when you've made white people upset. You feel you have to apologize. And I'm going to apologize last week, and I'm apologizing for stepping in and have to get off. But I want this group to think about we. Do we have a right to talk about we? Right. She was a European woman who did not know what she was talking about when she looked at America. And it was not that hard to have found out. She was obviously not with the people who could have told her about lynching, who could have told her about what was going on in this country. She was not there, and she was writing for whom? For us, quote, for we. So thank you very much, everyone, for indulging me. I'm in the studio right now making a piece that is going to be called The Contest, and I hope you all get a chance to see it.
I'd love
Bye-bye.
Bill. Thank you. I don't know if you're gonna hear an answer. I guess not. No, but I think that's important. And all I'll say is, I think there's always a challenge of who can say we, and in many ways, Arendt's work and all political philosophy work is about how we can speak in the first person plural, we. There's a famous essay that I read in graduate school called the first person plural. I forget who wrote it, but it's about that. It's about who can and who should and who is able to speak in the first person plural, the royal we, as we sometimes call it in grad school. And Arendt's work is about what does it mean to to create a world, a politics, that we can speak in the first person plural about. And then there's within a group like this, what does it mean for us to speak about we as a people in this group? And I guess, I mean, to some degree, I'm gonna say that I think it includes all of us, includes Bill, includes me, includes James, and all of us here. We're here around the table. We're part of the we, and I'm gonna stick to that. Happy to have people disagree with me on it. Stephen, you're up next.
Thanks, Roger. Just anything I've got to say is much less eloquent and urgent than the last two discussions. Just one point about Arendt's survey of the French existentialists. I thought it was interesting that she kind of maybe she excuses Camus and Malraux from the claim you made that the French existentialists their position would possibly lead, in Arendt's view, to amoral results. I think she noted that Camus and Malraux hailed the old virtues. She has that in on page 439. And I'm wondering if by hailing the old virtues, even if they didn't understand them the way they were understood in classical times, that the results would be not amoral at all, but might be something that we could all accept. I'll use the word we there just for the sake of clarity. So that's just one thing. And my second small bore point is that it was also interesting, I thought, that she has a kind of third category of thinkers that don't fall into either the French existentialist camp or the German camp directly, because they're the Catholic thinkers whom she seems to praise for reawakening an interest in an almost lost way of thinking about politics. I thought that was just another feature of her very comprehensive look.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. I'm just looking on page 439. Where does she say they praise the old virtues? I just want to make sure I understand where
near the top. I have it here.
Oh, I see. On the very top of the page. So
Yes.
from the angle of pure thought, all their solutions bear the hallmark of heroic futility, most noticeable in Camus and Malraux, who hail the old virtues in the spirit of a desperate defiance of their senselessness. Just a reminder, please mute your mics, please. If you're not speaking. See if I can figure this out. Thanks. So they hail the old virtues in the spirit of a desperate defiance of their senselessness. Thus Malraux insists that man save himself from death through the defiance of death in courage. So yes, they hail the virtues of courage, but in doing so, again, it's more, as she'll say down at the bottom of the page, courage, according to Malraux, challenges the human condition of mortality. They're going to hail these old virtues, but not because they're principles to which we aspire. They hail them because they allow us to act against and in defiance of an absurd world. And that's obviously a profound difference between the existentialists and the earlier, classical thinkers. On the question of the Catholic thinkers, right, which you raised, she looks at a number of thinkers who she thinks to some degree concern the political, and the Catholics do in some sense. The weakness of them is that they want to reassert a kind of old order. In a way, it goes back to the same comment you just brought up about the old moral values. The Catholics want to go back to the moral values and reestablish an order of the past. And so from her point of view, she doesn't take them as new political philosophers because they don't accept what she considers to be the fundamental reality of our times, which is the break of the tradition. They want to reestablish the tradition. They want to sort of think that the break is something that's curable and can be breached or repaired, and she doesn't think it can be. And so that's the problem that she finds in the Catholic tradition. Not just the Catholic tradition, also in many others, including Marxist tradition, and even the sort of she talks about a number of people who sort of seek to reread the past, a kind of a historical political philosophy that emerges, and so she's critical of these traditions. And then what she does is says there are a few people who take seriously this break of the past and try and nevertheless think without banisters about the world. And those are the two groups that she turns to in this essay. Does that make sense, Stephen? I mean, I don't want to dismiss the Catholic tradition. She obviously has great respect for it and finds it very valuable, but she doesn't think, I think, that it is an example of the new kind of political thinking she's calling for.
Yeah, I guess my take on it is that's all correct, I'm sure, but at least the Catholic thinkers got some ideas out there again that had kind of gotten lost in the general trend of European thought. So the idea is, if you separate the notion that some things are very important to think about that aren't covered in the ordinary way of thinking, then at least those ideas get into the mix again, and that may be of some service.
That's absolutely true. And so she actually says that. She says, the Catholic philosophers, because of their knowledge of the classic sources, brought the question of politics back into the world, and that was an important role that they played. So yes, she certainly thinks that it's valuable to turn to them and read them and encounter them. She just doesn't. She thinks there's too much of an attempt to deny this radical break that is part of the modern world. Tara, you're up next.
Hi, I wanted to ask about a specific quote, and my pagination is weird because I'm on an ebook.
Okay.
So I think it's like halfway through, and I'm just going to read it.
Can you just give me the paragraph that it begins with? How does the paragraph begin?
It begins, sorry. It's after the bullet points that.
Okay. Yep.
Global character. So it's the last bullet point.
Okay. Finally, the global character. Yeah.
So it starts, our problem is that our concept of freedom, at least in its political aspects, is inconceivable outside of plurality. And this plurality includes not only different ways, but different principles of life and thought. And then a universal society can only signify a threat to that, or to freedom. On the other hand, it is undeniable, and this is the second half of it is where I have this question of responsibility. It is undeniable that under conditions of non-unity, every nation feels the consequences and must bear the responsibility, not morally, but in plain political factuality, for every crime and blunder that may be committed at the other end of the world. I'm wondering if you could sort of unpack that a little bit in terms of this incredible interconnectedness that she points to, that seems to be then the kind of price of freedom. And I guess I'm interested in this section because I feel like it does get to the crux of some of our crises right now, which is this idea of plurality, not just being different ways of life, but different principles of life and thought.
Yeah.
And one of the rhetoric and some of the very strong beliefs, some of which I ascribe, are that some thoughts are not permissible anymore, including racism, fascism, etc. And so it seems like so much of the divide, at least in the US right now, is that there's a kind of zero tolerance from a lot of different levels.
Thank you, Tara. This is a great question and a great passage that I obviously didn't talk about in my introduction. So I'm really glad you turned our attention to it. So she starts with a worry, right? This is the overarching context of these bullet points, right? Is the discussion of Christian philosophy, Catholic philosophy, and the advocates of tradition, right, who deny the fullness of the break. One of the things they do, she says, is they speak about a kind of universal society, and that, there's two alternatives. There's totalitarianism and there's Christianity. Obviously, there's no attempt to equate Christianity and totalitarianism. I just want to make that clear. But what she says is those are different ideas of universality, and they both minimize the danger that universality poses for the loss of plurality and freedom. So that's the first part, right? And you asked about that, and that's fine. Then you say you turn to this last section of this paragraph. A universal society can only signify a threat to freedom, right? So whether it's a Catholic society or a Christian society or a Marxist society, or a totalitarian society, any kind of universal society, insofar as it rejects plurality, is a threat to freedom. On the other hand, right, she says it is undeniable that in a non-universalist sense, in a sense of non-unity, we will see around the world things that horrify us and bother us, right? I mean, if we have values here and there are different values in China and there's different values in who knows where in Europe, and different values in Africa and different values in Brazil, we will see things that upset us around the world. Freedom is not moral. Freedom is not going to lead to everyone having the same morality. And what she then says is, every nation must bear the responsibility, not morally, but in plain political factuality, for every crime and blunder that may be committed at the end of the world. What that means is we must take upon ourselves the responsibility that human beings who are free will commit crimes, will do things that are horrific. And we must feel that consequence and take that responsibility. And that is the only way we will begin to try and live freely in ways that are human and moral is probably not the word I want to use, but responsible. And so we have to, just like she says in The Origins of Totalitarianism, that after totalitarianism, we have to take into ourselves the responsibility that this is a possibility of mankind, that we all, as human beings, could have been, could live in a world and in a country that did something like what Germany and Bolshevik Russia did. And so she wants us to say that we have to take that responsibility into us. We have to internalize it. And that's the only way that we can seek to live freely and also maintain plurality by being, in a sense, humble at the dangers of freedom.
Can I respond briefly?
Yeah.
In
Yeah,
terms
please.
of sharpening it in terms of just the very current moment, which, and thank you, that was really helpful. But I feel like right now the urge is to completely reject any identity, say, if you're blue, right? Like, I mean, the major reaction to this election right now is, how could this be? How could so many people, right? It's a complete, and so I guess I just wanted to point that out, that I feel myself very much in that moment right now of, what's the line? When is it, when is the line to say, no, I won't identify, or yes, I have to. So I'm just gonna, but thank you, this was really helpful.
Yeah.
Can I jump in, Roger?
Okay.
Oh, sorry. I think that it might be helpful in terms of the question of responsibility. The last paragraph, and actually the whole essay by Arendt, collective responsibility in
Moral
judgment. Yeah. No, in collective responsibility, when she talks about the two conditions, basically in which she defines collective responsibility, belonging to a we that has committed a certain wrong, right? In whose name this wrong has been committed. She's talking about Germans, but also she mentions briefly, she doesn't go into the details, whites and Negroes, and this is her wording, not mine. And the second is a collective we cannot give up. Basically, if you're white, and you can't just give up that collective. And she's going to say at the very end that the price for belonging to the political community as a whole, who committed that crime, is actually political responsibility. That's the cost, and this is where action comes in. And I think that she's extrapolating this to the world, at that point, which is incredibly, I want to say incredibly sharp, but that's like a silly statement, right? But it is, acting responsibly means you have to do that because that's the cost you pay for belonging to the political community whose benefits you are part of. And that goes back to, in some way, Bill's point. And in terms of action, and Tara's question about, if I understood correctly, right, the intolerance, or what's the limit, I would read Arendt, but this is, just tell me, Roger and everybody, if I'm wrong, is that action, that redress of the cost you have to pay via political responsibility and action has to be done in such a way, following Kant's principle, right? Kant, but also Jasper's, right? Humankind, in such a way that the plurality between you and yourself and the plurality of all others can be preserved. So, I mean, that's not a clear-cut normative principle, but in a way it is. And you know, that's one comment. I have another comment, but I don't want to monopolize, so I'll leave that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mara. Maybe I'll try and answer your comment along with, or not really answer, respond to your comment along with Tara's. I take both of them to be in some sense a worry about how to respond today to political a kind of political polarization that seems so extreme to lead into a kind of dehumanization. And, you know, should we be trying to communicate in a Jasper sense and talk to people we disagree with? Or do we have to, in a sense, judge them and keep them at a distance? And I would say both. Arendt, you know, thinks that the first step in judgment is thinking, which includes thinking from the perspective of the other. Let your mind go wandering. And thinking, as she's going to say in this essay, along with Jasper's, is talking and communicating. So I think the first step of thinking and judging is reaching out to and thinking and seeking to think from the perspective of those you're engaged with. And that's a profoundly difficult and at times very existentially problematic act, because that thinking can be difficult, can be angry. But she thinks that's the first step. But thinking is not the end, right? It's just the first step. The second step is judging, and you have to be able to judge. Now, there are different kinds of judgments, right? There are mathematical or scientific judgments based on, you know, that kind of evidence. That's not a political judgment. There are moral judgments, and then there are what Arendt calls political judgments. And the difference between a political judgment is there's no syllogism, there's no rule for it. It has to be a free kind of judgment. And in a number of places, she argues that the way to judge people who you find to have acted in politically abhorrent ways is on the question of reconciliation. It's not a moral judgment. You don't judge the person, right? You judge the act they did. And she says, can I reconcile myself to living in a world where those people who do these kind of acts are part of that world? Or if I have people who do these kind of acts in the world, can I not reconcile to living in that world? And she says of those people, they must be killed, right? That's what she says about Eichmann. But she, you know, so when she asks the question of herself, can I reconcile with Heidegger, who she thinks did some immoral things? Her answer is yes. It's not that she says, I don't forgive him, but I can reconcile with him being in the world. And so, you know, I think, and what she says is that a judgment of reconciliation or a judgment of non-reconciliation is an attempt to say, in the language of we can reconcile with this or we cannot. And it's a question, because when we say we can reconcile with Trump supporters, right? We say we can live in a world with them. And then other people have to say yes or no. You know, do I agree with you? And if you say no, we cannot live with people who think like that. People also have to judge your judgment of reconciliation. And then you have to ask, you know, which one does a collectivity, a we, form around? The essence and nature of a political judgment is that it's an action that begs to be responded to. And people either respond to it positively or negatively, or other, you know, there's many ways they can respond to it. But that's how I think she understands political judgment. It's an aesthetic act, and then people will respond to it. So, you know, how does one respond today, you know, to the political divisions of our time? Well, first of all, let me say there are a wide range of people who voted for Trump, just like there are a wide range of people who voted for Biden. And I don't think you can put all of them on either side into one group. You know, and you need to talk to people. And in each case, you're going to have to ask, can I reconcile with that? You know, I think this question will come to the fore. This is a question I've been talking with some friends about this week. At some point in the next 2 years, Biden will have to make a decision about whether to pardon President Trump or not. And there will be many who say, don't do it, right? And there will be many who say, we have to be able to live in a community where we don't, you know, put political opponents in jail, right? I don't know what the right answer is. I'm just saying this will be a question that will come up in the next two years. And you're already seeing it asked. And Biden is not answering it. And it's a hard question. And I don't envy him in that answer. But how he responds, I think, will go a long way to determining how not only does the Biden presidency remembered, but how the United States moves on or doesn't move on from this crisis of partisanship.
Roger, can I add something on
Yeah.
Jasper's communication there? So
Yep.
I know a few people here have been also reading Jasper's together. I think there's an important distinction in the way that Arendt is reading Jasper's concept of existential communication here. So Jasper's talks about several different forms of communication, and Arendt's talking about existential communication, which is really at the center of a lot of his post-war work and thinking about questions of reconciliation. But one of the key elements of this understanding of communication, which makes it markedly different than John Stuart Mill or even Jürgen Habermas, is that you can't engage the other with an end, right? It's not utilitarian. You can't go into this form of communication with the desire to change the other person's mind, to convince them. This is not about, it's definitely not about hammering the other person with your opinions, but it's about creating an opening where two beings can meet one another and create the possibility for each other to realize their existence. And that is only possible in the space between people. And that can only be facilitated when these other kind of political quarrels is a good example, you know, or struggles, strife fall away and people can come together. And that's part of the phenomenal nature of the way Jaspers understands communication here. It's also, you know, it's very much in sync with Arendt's critique of utilitarianism and thinking about communication and judgment. And I think it's the hardest part to understand about this kind of existential communication, because we go into these conversations with each other wanting to win. We want to convince the Trump supporter or a family member. We think that we have the upper hand. But it's really, it has to be non-egoistic. there has to be a radical acceptance of the communication partner that you're engaging with. And for Jaspers, it very much is a moral question that requires both intellectual integrity and, you know, it moves toward this kind of existential truth.
Thank you, Sam. That's really important. I mean, I think, you know, I'm not sure where in Jaspers, so maybe you can, you know, I think that what you've just described as this existential communication is exactly what I understand Arendt to mean by thinking and speaking. But then when she talks about judgment, you need a space, you need a difference, you need what she calls the pathos of difference a bit, to distance yourself from that. I don't know if that fits with where Jaspers puts judgment into his understanding.
Yeah, I mean, so when Arendt's talking about judgment here, I hear it in two senses. One, in the kind of Kantian sense of cultivating the juridical citizen that exists inside each of us, and other in the more explicit kind of Kantian sense of the need to draw distinctions. So, you know, in the human condition, for example, Arendt draws the important distinction between otherness and difference. Judgment doesn't require that we other others in the world, but it does rest upon our ability to draw distinctions. Yeah. So the ability to draw distinctions for Arendt is very closely related to judgment, and it requires distance between ourselves and the world, right? But this is where we get into the kind of life of the mind work, and also where willing is so important. And, you know, it's thinking, judging, willing. You know, judgment, in order to judge, we have to repair the thinking person, the two in one, to re-enter the world and to engage in the activity of judging. But then willing is when, you know, we retreat back in and we're torn, right? You know, if thinking requires harmony in the Kantian sense, then willing is necessarily defined by inharmonious inner activity that's constantly ripping us in different directions. And we can't do anything from that, but it's necessary because that's where the weight of the soul shifts. That's Augustine in her writing. That's where the heart moves. And so the experiences that we have in the world, you know, inform our thinking. They also inform our willing. And all of these things for Arendt require distance, but there's just different kinds of distance. There's the distance necessary for judgment. There's the Archimedean point. There's the retreat into solitude from our experiences. There's the gap space and her insistence upon letting go of a temporally oriented future, any narrative of progress. You know, she's really, you know, and this is again, I think the, you know, part of how she's a phenomenal, you know, the philosophy of Jaspers in terms of phenomenology and existentialism comes in. I'm happy to put some Jaspers books in the chat box, and a few of us are reading Jaspers off grid very informally. If anyone wants to hang out with us after the VRG.
It's always good to read Jaspers. Stephen, I think Stephen Greenleaf, are you next? Maybe. Stephen, are you here?
Here I am. Here. Yeah. I have two comments. Going back to the very beginning, though perhaps picking up on what Samantha just said, James made a reference to a distinction between reasoning and thinking, and that struck me. My initial observation is that reasoning is public and thinking is private, and Samantha's comment makes me wonder how it's all related to judging. But if we think in private, but we take it to a table for conversation, we have to give reasons for our thought, or so I'm thinking. So that's one question, observation. The second was your own comment that Arendt, and I think you adopted it, that you want to speak about the world as it is. And that just strikes me as a little too simplistic, even though I'm a great believer in facts and the importance of facts. Getting to the facts seems like it should prohibit us from doing that. We can maybe, it strikes me as an over assertion, and not as subtle as I think we or she should approach the world, in fact. And I wonder if if it's consistent with her argument in Truth and Politics, which I haven't read recently enough to grasp that, because that seems kind of counter to my rather vague at this point recollection of what she argued there. Thanks.
Yep. Thanks, Steve. Yeah. So, I mean, the idea that we should say what is a translation of Herodotus that she cites in a number of essays, including Truth and Politics. And I don't think to say what is simply a simplistic idea of saying what the facts are. It's to you know, and it goes to the heart of what she thinks she's doing. It's to try and say what is and what is real, what is in the world. And it's not something that can be fact checked. It includes accepting facts, right? And not defactualizing the world. But I don't think it's limited to that. It means facing up to the world as it is, even when it's not what you want it to be. The unpremeditated, you know, attempt to face up to and resist reality, whatever it may be, as she says in numerous places. So to say what is another word, I think, another expression for what she might mean by understanding, or even reconciliation. It's another way to say, I think, to think what we are doing, to engage in an attempt to honestly confront what it is that we are doing and think about it. And that I take to be the aspiration of her work. So yeah, I mean, to say what is what she says she's trying to do in Truth and Politics. And to a certain degree, that's what thinking is for her. Can I leave there, or do you want to say more?
No, I mean, what I guess I hear you saying is don't take that too literally, or in the sense of merely being limited to facts. And in that sense, I wholly agree with that. So thank you.
Okay. Susan.
Yes. Hi. So I am.
Susan, before you start, I'm just going to read for Stephen the quote from Truth and Politics, right? She says, it's around the question of whether we can say that we should sacrifice truth for the survival of the world, right? And she says, what is at stake is survival, the perseverance in existence, and no human world destined to outlast the short lifespan of mortals within it will ever be able to survive without men willing to do what Herodotus was the first to undertake consciously, namely, legein ta eonta, to say what is. No permanence, no perseverance in existence can be conceived of without men willing to testify to what is and appears to them because it is. If we don't testify to what is and appears to us and speak honestly about it, we can't have a world that lasts and preserves and outlasts us. And so to speak the truth in that sense, not of mere facts, but to say what is at the very essence of what it means to live in a human world. All right, Susan, I just wanted to put that out there. Thanks. You go on.
So I am struggling with this passage on page 441, where she's talking about Kant's so-called moral philosophy is in essence political, insofar as he attributes to all men those capacities of legislating and judging that according to tradition had been the prerogative of statesmen. So, and then she says, moral activity according to Kant is legislation, acting in such a way that the principle of my action could become a general law. So I'm really not clear. Can you help me out with what
Yeah, no. This is simply from the Kant's either critique of practical reason or the groundwork of the metaphysic of morals. And she's here talking about the categorical imperative, which you may have read about or read. But there are a number of different statements of the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is simply a philosophical expression of what she takes to be, what Kant takes to be the ordinary understanding of law, which is that duty is the necessity to act out of awe before the law. Pflicht ist die Notwendigkeit einer Handlung aus Achtung vor dem Gesetz. And out of that awe before the law, when I as a rational being, as a split being who's on the one hand a Lebewesen, a living being, and thus created and rule following, and on the other hand a rational being who has reason in myself, and I know that when I get a glimpse of the fact that I am such a rational being as he thinks all human beings are, I am struck by the unbelievable beauty and logic, coherence, and extravagance of the fact that I am such a rational being. And out of awe before that insight into the fact that I, as a rational being, am a being that can see and know the law, I drop down on my knees, Kant says, and I pray and I submit myself to myself. I submit my inclinations and my subjective maxims and what I want to the law. And I freely take the law onto myself. And so as a moral or legal being, I legislate, but I legislate to myself. And in legislating to myself, I give myself the law, and I can only give myself laws that could be valid for all rational beings, and become a general law for all people. Because if I say, well, I can promise you that I'll be here tomorrow to talk to you, but I know I won't be there, but I just want to shut you up. If I can't make that a law for all rational beings, because then no one would follow their promises and promising would disappear. And so this is the categorical imperative for Kant. And it's the genius of it is that it unifies obedience and freedom, because in being obedient, I'm obeying myself as a rational being, the rational part of my nature. His so-called moral philosophy, he says, is political because he attributes to all men this capacity of self-law giving. We all give the law to ourselves. All obedience is freedom, and thus based in plurality. And that's what she takes out of Kant here. I'm sorry, I just taught this yesterday. So
Oh, great.
Where were you were you reading from somewhere, Roger?
No,
Just now.
no, this is stuff I know very well.
Oh, could you give us the reference for Kant?
Yeah, it's the groundwork of the Metaphysic of Morals, the Royal Kant Preußische Ausgabe, pages 427 forward. I mean, you know, if you get any edition of Kant's groundwork, they should have the Royal Academy edition pages in it. And this is all from page 427 to 437 in the Royal Preußische Academy Ausgabe. Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Fran Lamprecht.
Okay, thanks for taking my question. The question that I found interesting reading the text was like, who is man as a political being? Man or woman, I guess. And when Steve asked you earlier about like, or what you said in your introduction is that you take this reading group as a place where you teach us, or where we can learn to look at the world as it is. Not maybe to say as the world as it is, but as I understood you said, to look at the world as it is, as giving us a set of tools maybe to observe. I don't know if I understand that right or not, but then
I don't think I said I teach. I don't see myself teaching here, but
okay, but maybe like offering us possibilities that help us to look at the world as it is.
Yeah.
So I have like an example where I would like to ask, let's say, once they step into the world of appearances, into the light, so to say, how can I tell the difference between someone appearing as a human being and someone appearing as a political being? And
well, I mean, there's so many different ways I could try and answer that question. I mean, on one level, why are you assuming that a human being is not a political being? Right? Because for Arendt, I mean, Aristotle, as you know, defines man as a political being, a zoon politikon, who's also a zoon logon echein, an animal who has reason. And Arendt, I think, accepts both those definitions to a large degree. Now, she thinks that many human rights discourses go wrong insofar as they refute the idea that man is a political being and see man simply as an animal who is to be kept alive and protected outside of his or her political capacities. But I think she thinks of that as a dehumanization of man in the name of human rights. So, I mean,
but what would be the traits that I should look for? Like, what differentiates like someone coming as a human being and someone as a political being? I mean,
well, I think again, there's no one right answer to this. For me, Arendt defines human beings as those beings who can speak and act in public in ways that matter. This is my reading of Hannah Arendt. Comes from many places. It's obviously focused on book 9 of The Origins of Totalitarianism. But for me, Hannah Arendt defines what it means to be human as someone who can speak and act in public in ways that people will listen. They have the equality, the ability to appear. People can listen. They have to be part of a community in which they can speak and be heard and seen. And thus, if they say something meaningful, they can matter. And mattering, meaningfulness is to me the sort of quintessence of what it means to be human for Arendt. But one gets there through speaking and acting in public in ways that matter. But I mean, you know, so
But what,
so a human being who doesn't have that right or capacity, I mean, I think all human beings for her have the capacity. A human being who's put into a hole in a camp and can't appear in public in ways that matter, is deprived of their human rights. That's what it means for her to be deprived of one's human rights. To be
so
taken.
can someone appear in public and not be a political being?
Say that again, Mara. I mean, Fran.
Can someone appear in public and not be a political being? Are you automatically appearing in public as a political being?
Well, I mean, insofar as you appear and can be taken note of, I think you have the capacity for politics. I mean, if you appear in public in ways that no one notices you, you know, I think that's the, you know, you could say on the one hand, you're not being political, or you could say your politics is a kind of conformity that is sort of at a minimal basis. But I think anyone who can appear in public has the capacity and the right to act in ways that will be seen and heard and thus bring meaning to them. Maybe I'm not understanding your question. Am I not understanding your question?
Maybe I don't understand the question myself anymore.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway,
but it came from the point like, who is man as a political being?
I'll tell you again. I mean, I have a strong reading of this, which is not to say it's right or wrong. Man as a political being is someone who has the courage to leave their private life and act in the world or speak in the world in ways that can be seen and heard by others so that they can be judged. And in doing so, live a meaningful life, a life that has meaning, that means that people attend to you. That is what I think she thinks all human beings are capable of if they are given a space of appearance, a political realm where they can act. And
just to add, maybe for I think the answer to your question is in the human condition. She touches on it in other places. She says on page 3 at the bottom that every aspect of life is touched by politics. Okay. What makes a human being for Hannah Arendt is our capacity for logos, our rationality and our capacity for speech, and our ability to disclose who we are, and not just be what we are. It's our ability to disclose who we are, to make meaning from our experiences, and to tell stories that makes us human. And that's what separates us. And this is actually where Arendt becomes, I think, quite controversial in Origins and other places, because people who don't appear, people who don't speak, who don't act, who don't disclose who they are, aren't human, right? She doesn't call them human. She doesn't think of that as humanity.
That's right.
You're muted, Roger.
Sorry. I said, that's right. And I said, but she does think that all humans have that capacity. And it's up to them whether they actualize it. If they're living in a world where they can actualize it. And to not live in a world where they can actualize it is to deprive them of human rights. That's what it means to not have the right to have rights. I have to go, and we've hit our time. I mean, there's still a bunch of questions. Sam, do you want to stay on and take some, or do you need to go?
I can hang out for a couple minutes and then I'm going to have to go, but I'm happy to hang out for a few minutes.
I'm going to make you a co-host, so that you can keep going, if that's all right.
Sure.
Goodbye, everyone. Have a great, congratulations for those of you who are accepting congratulations for what happened this week. And for those who aren't, condolences. But I will say that at least we had in my view, a successful election in the sense that it happened and it seemed to happen according to the rules. And I take that as a very positive event that I wasn't sure was going to happen. I have to run. Sam's going to continue on a couple of the questions. Thank you all very much. But next week we begin reading The Promise of Politics. I look forward to that. You can get the book at Oblong off our website or anywhere you want, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. And I'll leave you to Sam. Thanks very much, Sam.